Good evening. My name is Crowley, James Crowley, of Jim and Parker's excellent podcast, and welcome to the special commemorative series detailing the 60-year cinematic legacy of British secret agent James Bond 007, Bond-tober.
Well, you only live twice is fine. It's just fine. I'll try to be nice. You Only Live Twice is one of the few Bond films that I really didn't grow up with, because every time a clip of it came on TV or anything, I just wasn't that much interested. I don't know why. There was just something about it that kind of put me off. And now that I've rewatched it, I think I kind of get the sense why. I think this film is one of the first times the franchise is guilty of style over substance, in my opinion. Because this is really the first time that the Bond film itself has practically nothing to do with the book. Now, if you guys have read the books by Ian Fleming, you guys know that this one comes after On Her Majesty's Secret Service, and there's a reason why it comes after On Her Majesty's Secret Service. Whereas in this case, once again, On Her Majesty's was delayed due to poor weather in Switzerland, which is the primary location in the book. And thus, it was decided to make You Only Live Twice instead, because it was much easier to access Japan at that time, and especially after the rocket success of Thunderball at the box office, they really wanted to go big once again. This is definitely, at least in the films of the 60s, the most ambitious in terms of its visuals, not only in terms of the cinematography. And they brought in Oscar winner Freddie Young, who had shot Dr. Zhivago and Lawrence of Arabia for David Lean, so that's already bringing in a legendary visual artist at this time, as well as giving Ken Adam the chance to build some of the biggest, most elaborate sets of his career, which I'll talk about a little later. There was definitely an emphasis to make this movie huge. Like, they had to top Thunderball in a way. If Thunderball made gangbusters, surely another blockbuster of this size would do the trick, but unfortunately, they really got lazy in terms of the story. And unfortunately, that comes from the fact that they changed writers midway through pre-production. They chucked out the source material for the reasons that they obviously weren't going to follow up on Her Majesty's Secret Service, so they had to do something a little different. But what they came up with is kind of pallid, I'd say. A little pale, a little pallid. Not very terribly engaging, especially. And what's even more shocking is that the script was written by Roald Dahl, who wrote such books like The Witches, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, The BFG, James and the Giant Peach. A lot of these really fascinating, kind of fractured fairy tales, I like to call them. I think that he really is one of the first people to really write fractured fairy tales. But seeing his name on this movie has deeply weirded me out ever since I found that out. It just, all of his usual panache and even his charm is just not present. This script very much felt like it was put together by committee. And it just felt like, well, what worked before? Oh, well, let's have a lot of gadgets, because that worked really well for us in Goldfinger and Thunderball. Let's have a big villain's lair, because well, they haven't really had a villain's lair, but they used to have kind of elaborate kind of sets for the villains. You know, a converted boat from Russia with Love, Goldfinger's Kentucky estate. Thunderball had a brilliant set by Ken Adam of the Spectre meeting room, and it had the Disco Volante, the underwater sets, and all those things. This one looks great, but it doesn't support the story, because the story is, you know, Bond is simply trying to track down a threat to both Russian and American space programs. Of course, they play it up in the most comical terms, like, oh, the U.S. and the Russians are fighting and they can't listen to each other. Good old Britain's going to step in. I'm sure at the time that was seen as very funny, but nowadays it's just so comically simplified that it just doesn't work too well for me. Plus, the machinations it takes for Bond to finally catch up to Spectre and get into that big lair are kind of weird. They decide to fake Bond's death at the beginning of the film so he could go undercover. It doesn't really work. Like, they immediately figure out who he is, so it's kind of pointless. He's paired up with some very intelligent Japanese agents, you know, Tiger Tanaka and Aki, and eventually Kissy Suzuki are his allies and his Bond girls at the same time. They decide, for Bond to better infiltrate the area where the rockets are supposedly disappearing, he should become a Japanese man and marry a Japanese woman who's one of Tiger Tanaka's agents. Literally, Bond is made up to look like a Japanese man, and it is... oh, God. Just take a look. Oh my God, that's just bad. No two ways about it. That's just bad. and it literally washes off, I guess, after they have this big water scene. So it pointless, meaningless, pointless. You know, I seem to be harping on plot lately, but simply because if you've listened to my podcast with Parker, he and I are both story guys. If the story just isn't that strong, then it really takes us out. And me especially, you know, trying to, you know, learn how to write my own scripts, how to develop a story. It just doesn't seem to fit together. It's very loose. It's kind of like a bomb shelter made out of popsicle sticks. Is that it can hold together if you just kind of turn off and let the visuals and the escapism flow. But the problem is even when you're sitting there trying to, those little things about the plot and how they get there, and these characters make certain decisions, it just feels so off that I just can't enjoy it on a story level. And does that mean I can enjoy it on a visual level or an acting level, a character level? Well, again, this is Freddie Young's photography, and the way they photograph Japan is absolutely gorgeous. I mean, there are several shots in there where I paused the movie and I just thought, God, I could study that shot for hours. And it's not just Freddie Young's photography, it's also due to the new director coming in named Lewis Gilbert, who, again, seemed to be a director mostly based out of England who could have some United States success, but it rarely was it attributed to him, but rather to the studio and the producer. Like, he directed a marvelous World War II story that I love called Sink the Bismarck, which is based on one of the most incredible sea stories of all time. And he has this great sense of Panavision photography, how to fill his screen from end to end with just great stuff. He knows how to block his scenes brilliantly. He knows how to capture the beauty of the natural environment, especially in this movie. And he seems to have a good rapport with his actors, and he seems to understand story in most of his other films, but in this one, I think because of that change in pre-production, they just decide, well, this script's as good as we can get it. Let's just go, because we need to get another movie out, because there was a year's delay in between Thunderball and You Only Live Twice. No longer would Bond films come out really 1 year after the other. There'll be an exception, which is in the next movie, or next video rather. You Only Live Twice is definitely one of the strongest visual Bond films. It really is. With that being said, the characters do not really hold that well. They're not particularly strong. They don't really work off each other very well, especially Sean. Sean just turned off by this point in production. He was resentful towards Saltzman and eventually to Albert Broccoli about how much money he was making. He felt exploited. And the Japanese press were not very kind to him. They were very invasive. And I think Sean just about had it at that point. And he was done playing Bond. He wanted to just get out of this. And so halfway through production, he announced to the world that he would no longer be James Bond. And if you watch some scenes in this movie, his performance is very inconsistent. I feel like there's some scenes where he still kind of has that feeling from Thunderball, which is, yes, I can still do this. And then there's other scenes where he looks completely checked out, not giving a damn. In fact, he even said that if Harry Saltzman ever walked on set, that he would stop working. And it did happen a couple times where Saltzman would walk on set in the middle of a shot, and Connery would just stop and just not do anything until Saltzman left. So it's definitely, I think it's Connery's maybe second, I want to say, I'll say it's his least good performance, because he's, like I said, there are some scenes where he can still carry off that charm and that presence that he had in the previous films, but it's clear to see that the man was just completely out. Didn't really want to do this anymore, and had the attitude of, right, well, let's finish this so I can go off and be a good actor, which is actually what happened, but we'll get to that. Maybe we'll get to that. You know, these videos are already getting longer than I anticipated. You know, the Bond girls in this are not particularly memorable, really. The only one I can make a case for is Aki. She seems to have spunk, which, thank goodness, there's somebody in this movie who has it. She should have carried on through the end, I think. Instead, they make a decision to replace her with Kissy Suzuki, who doesn't make much of an impact. In fact, she doesn't have terrible many lines. That was simply because the actress could not learn English fast enough, and so she was actually cast as Aki, and then they decided to switch. There's actually a little bit of a darker reason, but I don't want to get into that. So they just don't make too much of an impact. Tiger Tanaka is actually kind of a fun ally for Bond. He's not as warm as Karen Bay. He has a different dynamic with James in that he's also the head of the Japanese Secret Service, but he also sort of takes Bond under his wing a little bit. And there's a little bit of a sexist scene, I suppose, where he takes James to a bathhouse, and he says in the Japanese culture, the men come first. It's such a 60s kind of attitude.
Rule number 1 is never do anything for yourself when someone else can do it for you.
And number 2?
Rule number 2, in Japan, men always come first, women come second.
I might just retire to here.
the way Tamba, the actor, plays it off is actually very he gives it a little bit of legitimacy, I think, in that this guy kind of has that swagger, the same as James, and James is just kind of taken by surprise by that. Needless to say, there's a femme fatale in this movie, Helga Brandt, played by Karen Dor. She's basically Fiona Volpe reincarnated without any of the personality or the charm. Her impact on this movie is very slight, and that's no dig against Karen Dor herself. It's just, again, the screenplay just isn't that good, and they just don't know what to do with her, really. And that is kind of a weakness of the film in general, is the villains are not good. I don't like any of the villains. In fact, we finally get a reveal as to this recurring character throughout the films, number one of Spectre. His name is revealed to be Ernst Stavro Blofeld, and he had been played by other actors in silhouette. Like, I do understand that they were trying to build him up, try to create this silent menace. And in the previous films, he has that, because he also has a voice that makes him very mysterious, very continental almost. And I just thought, well, boy, I can't wait to see this guy. In this movie, when I saw the credits, it said, and Donald Pleasance, I thought, I wonder who he plays. And as soon as I heard his voice over the still obscured shots of Blofeld stroking the white cat, I thought, oh no. Because I love Donald Pleasance, but honestly, every time they reveal him, this is my reaction. Honest Engine.
I am Ernst Stavro Blofeld.
You serious?
Yeah, seriously, that is me. That does not help the film at all for me. And again, that was another last minute decision during the production. They had another actor. They thought he looked too friendly, too warm of a presence on screen, so they thought, well, Donald Pleasance can, because Donald Pleasance, in some performances, if you watch his, like Sam Loomis, or even his performance in THX 1138, he can be genuinely creepy, while still kind of having that presence where it's just like, okay, I can follow this, I buy this guy. Maybe it's just because he had no time, maybe because he just... maybe because they were behind schedule. I don't know. He just can't carry it off. And I know I'm going to make a lot of Bond fans mad about that. None of us can really agree on who's the best Blofeld out of the bunch. There's been a lot of them. He's just not the one I like at all. Again, I need to repeat. So... one of the fun things about this movie is that the action sequences are actually pretty good. Gilbert gets some clever staging done in one of the big rooftop fights near the docks, and they do it as a one-shot from a helicopter, which was a nice change of pace. It's very well staged. The movements on the roof complement the movement of the helicopter. Sean looks great, kicking these guys' butts. It's a fantastic scene. And another great scene features, in fact, features this lovely little lady. She is known in the film as Little Nellie. She's a gyrocopter built for war. She has... In fact, Corgi did a beautiful job on this, don't you think? She has heat-seeking missiles, some other missiles hidden away in here. I'm not going to set them off because I'll never find them again, I swear. And back here, flamethrowers. And she moves fast and she's maneuverable. It's a wonderful little gadget from Q. And there actually is some really good dialogue when Bond checks in after this big battle with helicopters over a volcano crater. It says little Nellie defended her honor. That was actually very fun dialogue. Props to Dahl for that. And what's great about the sequence too is that was a second unit photographed scene which Peter Hunt actually directed. He had been the editor previously, and he was promised that he could direct On Her Majesty's Secret Service, but of course the film was delayed, so depending on who you ask, he either went on vacation or he decided to quit the series. But by happenstance, the producers ran into him in Tokyo, which was their base of operations. They convinced him to come back to supervise the edit, and of course he says, I'd like to direct the second unit, and of course they gave it to him. And just evidenced from the helicopter Little Nellie fight are the hallmarks of what kind of dynamic direction he has, what he would use, and especially in the next segment of this video, which is one of the masterpieces of the Bond movies, in which he served as the full-on director. And of course, I'll talk about that in a little bit. You Only Live Twice has one of, again, another excellent Bond song and another excellent score by John Barry. The song You Only Live Twice was written by John Barry and lyrics by Leslie Bricusse, and has an incredible opening with these really powerful, lovely strings that kind of lull you into this almost dreamlike state. And what surprised me was that the song was sung by Nancy Sinatra. Now, she's a great performance artist, but she never really sang too many ballads that I can remember. And if she did, maybe not particularly well. Her vocals are haunting, to say the least. While the previous films had been kind of smooth and loud and kind of, overpowering a little bit, this one, her vocals are very soft and very slow. And it really allows you to listen to Bricuss's lyrics, which are very poetic, which it was a very interesting change of pace, and kind of gave me a false flag about the movie coming back to it, because I guess I had always missed the credits whenever I saw it on TV, or because when I first saw it again in high school, when I listened to that song, I thought, God, maybe this movie's great. If it has this, well, it didn't, but definitely a song worth listening to over and over for me. And Barry gets another great score in, of course. I mean, the man could do hardly any wrong. In one of the Roger Moore episodes, he goes badly wrong in one sense, but I'm going to save that for later. The true MVP of this movie is production designer Ken Adam. Because in this movie, he was tasked with creating the ultimate villain's lair in a carved out volcanic crater, a hollow volcano, with a moving metal roof, a working helipad, a working monorail that was almost 2 or 3 stories high on the back lot at Pinewood Studios where they filmed these movies. And just looking at it, you can see the amount of dedication it took to not only build the thing, but to furnish it, to light it, to get it set ready was incredible. And you can see this definitely is one of the bigger scope movies of the whole franchise, and it does lead to an amazing climax. I will say that, despite the presence of Donald Pleasance and his very frightened cat. If you look in some of the shots, it's actually really funny. There's the ninjas rappel in, Bond's ninja friends rappel in down from the roof. There's explosions going on. There's stuntmen bouncing on trampolines as they get blown up. It's a really dynamic action scene, and unfortunately it's done in by a really poor volcanic explosion effect at the very end of the scene. Again, the effects just seem to get worse the more money they get, which is really surprising. That really is a highlight of just what Ken Adam was really capable of if he was given the time and the money. In fact, the set for the volcano cost $1 million, which was the price of Dr. No, something that was not lost on Ken Adam during production, nor was it lost on the producers. So, of course, when they obviously got their money's worth with the sets and the photography and the gadgets and sometimes a witty line or two. But for me, that doesn't make up for kind of a bit of a sluggish pace, a lackluster screenplay, and lackluster performances, and a lackluster 007. So, You Only Live Twice is definitely one of the Bond films I watched the least. But with that being said, again, much like Thunderball, you can watch it easily. You could either not like it, or you might like it. You could find something great about it. You might find something lesser about it. It's a movie that isn't necessary to watch for the Bond series. I really only watch it if I do a major rewatch of the series, or for this review I had to watch it again just to make sure I didn't miss much. So, yeah, on to the next. I got suckered in by a lot of the fans when it comes to this movie, because everybody told me, oh, it's the one-time Bond, he gets married, you don't want to watch it, it's garbage. How wrong was I to sleep on this movie until I was a sophomore in high school? On Her Majesty's Secret Service is one of the greatest James Bond movies ever. I am about to state my case. After the controversy surrounding Sean Connery's leaving in You Only Live Twice, the producers had to go back to square one, but of course, who do you cast to follow up the legendary Sean Connery? Well, a lot of actors were considered, including Adam West, for some reason, and Timothy Dalton, who passed on the role because he felt he was too young in his early 20s, which, okay. Eventually, they decided to go with an unknown once again with Sean Connery. The producers felt that they could easily achieve what they achieved with Connery if they got a new Bond and they could sort of groom him to become the next great star that Sean became. And their search eventually ended with former used car salesman and male model George Lazenby from Australia. Lazenby had a little bit of acting in commercials, especially for Fry's Chocolates. He was known as the Big Fry. He would carry a big chocolate bar, a big box of chocolate on a beach, and that was basically it. However, Lazenby actually had a great story about how he got the attention of Harry Saltzman, which was basically dress like Sean, cut his hair like Sean, get a Rolex watch, sneak past a secretary, say he had acted in countries that they couldn't possibly check, and then when it got to a certain point, he says, I'm not an actor. So he kind of lied his way. It worked for him up until the point where they needed to cast him, and what really sold them was his physicality, if not his acting. Which, I'll get to that in a little bit, because he probably does put up some of the best fights in the entire franchise. Now, the problem is since he was so inexperienced, they didn't want to follow their normal casting for the Bond girl, which up to this point, except for maybe Honor Blackman, had been, unknown girls, actresses who were in beauty pageants or models of some sort. In this case, they decided, well, since our leading man is not experienced, we are going to get a very experienced leading woman, and they settled on the incredible Diana Rigg as the Bond girl Tracy DiVincenzo. Diana Rigg has such a refined quality about her acting and her voice, her diction, how she walks on screen, how she carries herself, that she does slightly overwhelm Lazenby at times, simply because Lazenby, of course, this being his first movie, he's still trying to get the hang of things. However, with that being said, this is a movie that almost entirely relied on the believability of Tracy, because this is the first time that Bond in the movies truly fell in love with somebody. On Her Majesty's Secret Service is one of the most surprising books in the series, because Bond actually has a legitimate romantic relationship. In the books, this would be his second great love after Vesper Lynd from Casino Royale. But in the movies, this would be his first love ever, because he's obviously the ladies' man, he sleeps around, and in this movie he sleeps around a lot because of the plot detail of the Angels of Death in this mountain retreat that Blofeld is holed up in, brainwashing these girls to do his bidding. It's actually a good plan to brainwash these girls to start spreading disease, and then he collects the ransom for the cure. It's actually really good. It's actually a fantastic idea, and of course nowadays it's probably seen as a little too prescient, spreading a virus around the world. We're technically in the endemic of the COVID pandemic, but still no end in sight, really. And so when Bond and Tracy are together, there's a really smart decision made by writer Richard Maybaum and director Peter Hunt, who is now a full-on director. He was finished with the editing on the previous films. Now he was going to step in as director. And they made a very key decision in the approach to this film, which was film the book, basically. With, of course, some alterations, some character drops, some things get switched around, some additions. As you would with any film, you have to adapt. You have to leave some things out or put some things in. But this is very, very close to the book, and that's actually a boon in its favor, especially after the big bombastic but kind of flat You Only Live Twice. It was nice to get a story back about character and espionage, and Bond really having to use his own wits and leads from his investigation rather than just relying on a gadget to help get him out of a situation. And I think a lot of that, too, was because Hunt did not really care for the direction that the films were going in that regard. So he decided to stick close to the book. In fact, it was known that in between setting up his shots, he would always be reading his own version of the book. And, heavily annotated. He would sometimes come up with shots in there. And his direction is great in this. And the fact that he was saddled with having to direct this new guy who didn't know how to act, he manages to work George off very well. There's a sense that this Bond is still the same Bond that we've been following, which a lot of fans don't. They think 007 is just a code name. James Bond is a code name. I don't believe so. I think it's just the case where, well, one actor aged out or quit, so we're just going to keep going. So that was an unenviable task, I must say, but the fact that George is as good as he is in this movie, and I think he actually is very good, is both miraculous and just a testament to how dedicated Peter was to making sure that this movie worked. And it also helped that he brought a very contemporary style to the photography in this movie. This movie is one of the better looking of the bunch. In fact, he actually called up a younger B-list director of photography who was a cam operator on a lot of the second unit before, named Michael Reed. And he instructed Reed to light the sets naturally, which was a huge change from the very studio-bound kind of what they call high-key cinematography, which is a lot of overhead, a lot of high-key lights, whereas this one is filmed much more naturally with more natural light and a lot of kind of lamps and a lot of minimalistic stage lights. And it really works beautifully, especially when you look at things like the opening scene, which is basically a day for night. It's so gorgeous to look at. And the dynamic camera, the zooms that they use, which was very in vogue in the 1960s, actually helped give this movie a very unique identity, which has put a lot of people off, but for me it was absolutely thrilling to see this. I didn't think a Bond movie could look like this, in this specific time period. I always kind of have this idea of what a 60s film looks like. And this one kind of defied the expectations. It kind of had some of the hallmarks of the old Bond films, which is, long shots, a lot of one takes, sometimes simple blocking. But the thing is, there's a lot of use of the natural environment, which I think is fantastic. A lot of this was filmed on location in Switzerland and Portugal, especially in the Piz Gloria mountain lair, which is actually now a very famous mountaintop restaurant that has a rotating dining room. And it's obvious that they filmed most of it on location because the light is capturing the location in a very specific way. The snow. I love movies that are kind of filmed in kind of this half snow, half sun kind of look. I don't like whiteouts a lot, but this one has such a beauty to it, which was necessary to buy this love story. Coming back to the love story, it was so necessary for that to occur because James and Tracy have this really, for me, this beautiful love story. I mean, Rig and George actually really have good chemistry together. It's kind of surprising that they do, and there's a lot of great moments between the two of them, very quiet moments. There's a wonderful scene where Bond is on the run from Blofeld and his henchmen and his henchwoman Irma Bunt, played by Ilsa Steppat, who is one of those great henchwomen. And in the books, she actually is Blofeld's wife. And she doesn't get talked about too much, which is a real shame because it was one of Steppat's last performances. She died a few short weeks after the film opened. Anyways, the scene... Bond is trying to hide. He's in a crowd. It's like Christmas where they are. There's a big Christmas celebration with fireworks and a lot of light, which is not helping him. And he's trying to huddle up, and they're closing in on him, and you see these 2 feet on these skates kind of stop in front of him. The camera pans up, and it's Tracy. That's good. That's good stuff. That's good storytelling. And then it leads to this beautiful scene between the two of them in a barn, where Bond proposes marriage, which I think really shocked audiences back in the 60s, and I think it still does when people think Bond proposes marriage. Yeah, it definitely shocked me when I heard about that when I was a kid. I thought it was a joke. But it's marvelous. This movie is so chock full of these great moments of cinematography and storytelling and acting. One of my absolute favorites, I think it might be one of my favorite sequences in all of James Bond, is the final helicopter attack on Piz Gloria. Tracy has been captured by Blofeld, but she still holds her own. In fact, there's a great scene between her and Blofeld before the attack that's brilliantly written and performed. But we see these 3 helicopters coming in the dawn light, and the John Barry's music is starting to build, and you see this amazing, gorgeous view of Lazenby arming himself with a machine gun, and the sun, the dawn sun, is just flaring behind him, and the guns go off, and the James Bond music starts blaring. It's what a great sequence! Honestly, what a great sequence it is, and so many great things happen in that sequence. Bond sliding on the ice, Tracy holding her own against this big brute, and I just think for me, that for my money, that's one of the best build-ups to an action sequence, and then a great action sequence follows it. The build-up, those shots of the helicopters and Tracy listening in on the radio because her father's with him, it's just marvelous. Marvelous. It just makes me think, why on earth did I sleep on this movie? How could I have done that? I shouldn't do that. I should never have done that. It was a big mistake. And of course, there is a great element that I haven't talked about. Is my favorite Blofeld is Telly Savalas in this movie. What he really does for me is he captures this idea that he is the head of this big organization. He has all the power because, Savalas holds his cigarette a very specific way. He speaks very softly, almost like Bond is a bit of a nuisance, but he's amused. He gets down and dirty. He goes after Bond himself. He chases after him with his henchmen. He sets off an avalanche, which, captures Tracy. And he comes off as much more smart and has much more of a presence than Donald Pleasance could ever have, or the Blofeld following in the next video could ever possibly dream to have. This, for me, is the best performance of Blofeld, for hands down for me. Nothing will ever change that.
You'll be very useful in helping to convince the authorities that I mean what I say, and I'll do what I claim.
Now, this movie's reputation is for the ending, which, if you don't want to know what it is, I'll bid you adieu. Go watch the film, and then you can come back. For those who have seen it, let's talk about it. The movie ends with the marriage of James Bond to Tracy, and it's a lovely event. There's a lot of flowers everywhere. It was filmed in Portugal, again, on location. And M is there, Moneypenny's there, Q. There's a beautiful, beautiful moment that Peter Hunt came up with on set, which was Bond is about to get into the car. He sees Moneypenny, and of course, tears in her eyes because she's sad that James has tied the knot. And there's been a running gag throughout all the films where James, every time he comes into the office, throws the hat onto the hat hook, and he looks down and he tosses the hat to Moneypenny, and she catches it. That, bless you, Peter Hunt, that was great. But of course, the happiness is short-lived because they stop off to remove some flowers off their car, and Bunt and Blofeld drive by, gun down the car, and poor Tracy dies in Bond's lap. And it's... Look at me. It actually really upset me when I saw it, because I knew it was coming. But when it happened, I was just stunned. Because it had the gall to do that, and on the heels of a very well-developed relationship in the film, I was sad. And George is actually incredible in that scene. He really delivers the best work in the whole movie is right there for him.
It's all right. It's quite all right, really. She's having a rest. We'll be going on soon. There's no hurry, you see. We have all the time in the world.
And it just, I think it was just a little too much for 60s audiences to take, because first of all, they weren't really sold on the idea that Bond could ever have a marriage, a relationship. But this was just a little far for them. And even when Hunt and Lazenby read the book, they both said that they cried. And that's what they wanted to capture on the screen. And they really do that. And there's this really haunting tie-in to the Bond song. That's because obviously On Her Majesty's Secret Service is a mouthful, so it would never translate well to a song. Now, John Barry decided to go back to an instrumental for the main titles, and it's a marvelous, incredible, beautiful concoction of Moog synthesizers and orchestra. It just, every time I hear it, I get the chills and my heart skips a bit, because I just think, oh yes, that's On Her Majesty's Secret Service. So they decided for the song that there would actually be a romantic song between James and Tracy, and that is We Have All the Time in the World. And the melody of it is haunting in and of itself. The melody plays over Tracy's death, and it's just the orchestral. It's oof. Also, it's sung in the movie by none other than Louis Armstrong in one of the last projects he ever did before his death. And it's his voice. A lot of people like to make fun of his voice for being very gravelly, but it works really phenomenally well for this, because it's very grounded. It almost sounds like something that they would hear between themselves, and in that montage of them hanging around her father's estate and sneaking a kiss in every now and again, along with some soft focus of leaves in the sunlight. Reception to this movie at the time was not as glowing as I'm giving it. And there are some problems to the film. You know, the film can run a little long. And that was, I think, because Hunt really didn't want to lose anything, because he loved the book and he loved Maibaum's script too much. I think that things could have been trimmed just a little bit. Lazenby, there are some scenes where his lack of experience does shine through a little bit. But I feel like most of the time the good scenes he has outweighs the bad. And another thing too is some of the sets and fashion are very contemporary, like kind of, you know, they kind of tap into what was going on in the world at the time, you know, very tie-dye, kind of the swinging London look, if you will. But of course, it didn't really hurt the movie for me, because it was done very tastefully, I think. There was a tasteful balance of the contemporary and what had come before of the style of Bond. So and it doesn't really affect me too much. Sometimes the editor, John Glenn, who is going to be a big player later on, sometimes the editing feels a little odd, but I feel like it's meant to be that way, because of course Hunt, being an editor by trade, he would know, hey, I'm shooting it this way for a reason. So I'm sitting there as a director myself, and I'm thinking, I wonder why he cut it that way. And sometimes I think, no, that just feels like a 60s thing to do. But otherwise I think, okay, that's actually good. Like, there's a great cut in a fight between James and one of Tracy's bodyguards, where there's a snap cut to the bodyguard taking a lamp, and the camera pans down with the lamp as it smashes on the corner of the table, and then it cuts immediately. It's like, that's good action editing. So, contemporary audiences were not hot on this movie, and the critics the critics were mixed. Some liked it, some didn't. Some thought it was a great departure, some thought it was too much. George was universally panned across the board for being an imitator. Basically, you're not Sean Connery, so how dare you step into James Bond's shoes. Now, with that being said, George's behavior behind the scenes was less than stellar from a lot of accounts. Even he admitted himself that he became very arrogant. He threw his money around. He tried to throw his weight around. He slept with a lot of women. He was drunk quite a bit. Now, as he said, he tried to live like James Bond, and he tried to be a star even though he was not yet. So, when he decided, and this was his decision, he decided not to continue with Bond because he felt that Bond was kind of phased out. There were a lot of great films coming out at the time, like Easy Rider, which were much more, or Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, which were more in touch with what audiences wanted at the time, compared to what Bond was seemingly holding on to rather than setting the trend. And so he left on his own accord, and according to all involved, nobody was sad to see him go. Everybody was very happy to be rid of him. And that would lead to Sean coming back for the next film, but of course we need to save that for the next video, because I don't want to tarnish On Her Majesty's Secret Service by talking about the next movie at all. So, really, my advice to you is to go watch On Her Majesty's Secret Service. You're going to get something very unique, very different, very cool, very surprisingly emotional. Probably a gem in the crown of James Bond. And it's stuck around for a while. Its reputation has actually grown. It has all the time in the world to keep growing. So, with that being said, I will toast this one because it deserves it.